Welcome back to another episode of Space This Week, sponsored by Ground News, and we have lots to discuss today. SpaceX fired two things, Raptor 3 and shots, and they confirmed the readiness of Ship 30 and Superheavy 12 for flight number 5. We also saw a Falcon 9 first stage make its 22nd launch and landing, and China launched its answer to Starlink, and also created a massive debris field in the process when the upstage of the rocket exploded. Starliner astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams are now looking increasingly likely to be in need of rescue by a SpaceX Crew Dragon. Electron launched the third of 4 dedicated launches for Capella Space, and Blue Origin actually shared some new information about New Glenn. All of this and a whole lot more, so sit back and enjoy. Ship 30 is the next Starship in line to fly to orbit aboard Superheavy. It completed a full-duration static fire test in late July, but following this it was returned to the build site, whereupon one of its Raptor engines was replaced. It was then later returned to the mobile static fire pad and transported back to the Massey's test site for presumed repeat of the static fire test. But the fire never came. Instead, last week, we saw just a spin prime test, which is essentially the same as a static fire, except the test is cut short right before ignition takes place. We weren't sure if this was an aborted static fire test or a planned spin prime only test all along, but shortly afterward, the vehicle was returned to the production site, so I guess SpaceX were happy with just the spin prime and static fire wasn't actually planned at all. Are further changes going to be needed, or is Ship 30 now ready for orbital launch? Well, SpaceX recently announced that yes, both the Starship and Superheavy for Flight 5 are now ready to fly, pending regulatory approval of course. The reason the FAA license may take a little bit longer this time is because of the change in plan from the previous flights. Most notably, SpaceX will of course be attempting a booster catch with the arms of the tower, an unprecedented step in an orbital rocket launch profile that will no doubt increase the time required for the FAA to sign off on the flight plan. Elon posted on Twitter that he expects the flight to take place in about 3 weeks. As chief engineer and SpaceX owner, he will be in direct communication with the FAA, so here's hoping that this is a reasonably accurate timeline. In preparation for the catch attempt, SpaceX rolled booster prototype 14.1 back out to the launch pad last Wednesday to conduct further catch tests after implementing some modifications to the chopsticks, including the very recent installation of more bumper pads. The unit was lifted into the launch mount, and so far we haven't seen much testing take place, but we have seen some movement of the chopsticks very recently, so who knows? By the time you're watching this video, some more progress may have been made. Subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss updates with this. SpaceX also noted in their announcement post that while they wait for approval, they will begin testing of Flight 6 hardware. But it seems it's not just Flight 6 hardware that they're testing right now. Raptor 3 roared for the first time last week. When this was first unveiled a couple of weeks ago, a lot of folks, myself included, felt that this looked so clean it could almost be a 3D render. I mean, I can show the comparison I used in last week's video, compare it to 2 other modern engines, Ariane 6's Vulcain 2.1 and Vulcan's BE4. Raptor 3 looks so minimalist by comparison. United Launch Alliance boss Tory Bruno felt these photos were a little dishonest, describing it as a partially assembled engine and not the complete article. But it did look pretty much as is in this photo of it in the test stand, ready to begin hotfire tests. And this was then confirmed when Gwynne Shotwell, president and chief operating officer of SpaceX, posted this picture of the engine undergoing its first round of testing with the cheeky caption that it works pretty well for a partially assembled engine. Gwynne shot and shot well, it would seem. That was rubbish, I'm sorry. But in all seriousness, the engine could be missing thrust vector control systems, which don't matter a huge amount in the context of Raptor, as not all the engines for Starship require this. But then again, it might. We really don't know. Both pictures we have of Raptor 3 in the test stand have the top conveniently cropped out, possibly to hide the design from competitors or due to ITAR, though this will be hard to keep hidden when they're actually in use at Starbase, so who knows. I'm sure we'll see the operational versions of Raptor 3 being rolled around at the Starbase production site very soon. I guess a big reason why Tory wants to make it clear that ULA are just as primed for missions as SpaceX are is because they, and basically every other space company, depend on government funding. Because ultimately, space is expensive, so a lot of projects are dependent on government contracts and funding, so of course, naturally, space news can sometimes get a little bit political. And when we start hearing reporting from both sides of the political spectrum, it can be difficult to tell how reliable the reporting can be. Today's sponsor, Ground News aims to tackle this very issue. Founded by a former NASA engineer, Ground News offers clarity in the media, breaking down each story by providing information on the reporting outlet's ownership, political biases, and factual accuracy of their sources. One standout feature for me is the blind spot feed, which highlights stories missed by one side of the political spectrum, and Ground News surfaces 20 such stories every day. Let's take a look at a recent article about last month's Starlink launch failure, where the second stage of the rocket failed to deliver the satellites to their target orbit. Ground News' bias distribution shows a fairly even mix of left-leaning, centrist, and right-leaning sources. By clicking on these 3 tabs, you can see how each side reports on the story, and for an even quicker overview, the AI-powered bias comparison tab reveals the left focuses on the technical details, the center on the aftermath, and the right on the broader implications. Ground News' mission to bring transparency to the media landscape is something I really admire. If you want to get behind them too, then visit ground.news/Matt Lowne to get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan for just $5 per month. This plan includes all the features mentioned and more. One of the other big things we're watching at Starbase right now is the construction of the second launch tower, which has been rising at a pretty insane cadence, but seems to have stalled at 6 segments high, with no more pieces being added during the past week. The reason for the pause in action is to allow time for teams to reconfigure the CC-8800 crane to make it big enough to continue building the tower. Once this work is completed, the tower rise should hopefully continue. Last Monday, I covered SpaceX's second of 3 Falcon 9 launches to carry the Cygnus spacecraft to the International Space Station, and at the time of that video's publication, the spacecraft was still en route to the ISS, but now it's arrived. Last Tuesday, NASA astronauts Matthew Dominic and Jeanette Epps guided the station's Canadarm2 to capture the spacecraft and berth it to the station, delivering over 3.5 metric tons of supplies. Which is good, because, of course, there are 2 extra crew members on board the station right now, Butch and Sunny, who are still here 9 weeks into their 8-day Starliner mission, as NASA continues to look into whether or not it'll be safe for them to return to Earth on the capsule that brought them there. Interestingly, the upcoming NASA SpaceX Crew 9 mission is now delayed. NASA has postponed the launch from the 18th of August to the 24th of September. This delay will serve 2 objectives. Number 1, it gives NASA and Boeing more time to evaluate Starliner before the next capsule arrival, and 2, NASA will need time to consider reducing the crew number for the Dragon capsule in case Butch and Sunny need to return to Earth via Dragon instead of their Starliner. Why will NASA need this time? Well, aside from the managerial side of things, it turns out that Starliner will likely need a software update before it can perform an autonomous re-entry. Yes, Ars Technica has reported that 3 separate well-placed sources have confirmed that the current flight software on board Starliner can't perform an automated undocking from the station and re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, and that the process to update the software on Starliner will be non-trivial and significant, and that it could take up to 4 weeks. This was then further elaborated upon on Wednesday, when NASA confirmed that they have been quietly working alongside SpaceX about possibly having Dragon serve as a rescue vehicle for Butch and Sunny. So right now, Boeing's time to convince NASA that Starliner is safe to return the crew is rapidly running out. How do you think Butch and Sunny will return to Earth, Dragon or Starliner? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Anyway, back to Falcon 9's launch activity last week. We saw 3 other launches, 2 of them being earlier today. The one that took place, not today, was last Saturday. This was a Starlink mission which placed 21 Starlink satellites to Shell 8 after launching from Cape Canaveral Launch Complex 40. The first stage successfully landed on the Just Read the Instructions drone ship following stage separation, marking this booster's 21st successful mission overall, which is a very impressive number. One of the launches today was another Starlink mission, this time launching 23 satellites from Cape Canaveral Launch Complex 39A to Shell 10, and the first stage again made a successful drone ship landing. As for the other Falcon launch today, this lifted off from Vandenberg, carrying 2 telecommunication satellites to a Molniya orbit, which is a type of high elliptical Earth orbit. The 2 satellites are a collaborative project between Space Norway, the US Space Force, and British telecommunications company Inmarsat. Meanwhile, the Falcon 9 first stage for this mission, B-1061, touched down on the Of Course I Still Love You drone ship, marking an incredible 22nd overall landing. This puts it in joint first place for number of missions flown, matching B-1062's flight number. Will one of them make it to 25, do we think? Last Tuesday, China launched the first group of 18 solar sail polar orbit satellites. These were carried to orbit on a Long March 6A from the Taiwan Satellite Launch Center in China's Shaanxi province. These satellites represent the first batch of the first generation of China's space sail constellation, China's answer to SpaceX's Starlink. China plans to launch more than 100 of these satellites in this year alone, and thousands more by 2030. And they'll need to, if they want to match SpaceX's numbers. Starlink currently consists of over 6,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. Currently, China are aiming for a total of 15,000 in orbit by the end of the decade. But wait, what's this? It later transpired that the rocket's upper stage, that carried the satellites there, reportedly exploded, creating a debris cloud of hundreds of pieces, and given its high altitude, this debris is likely to remain there for several years. Now, this is now the fourth time a Long March 6A stage has broken up like this, with only 3 launches without this happening, so this is clearly a design flaw of Long March 6A, and a more responsible operator would have grounded the fleet until it was solved. I guess China feels above all that though, and has now created a potentially very dangerous debris field in orbit. In contrast, SpaceX deploys their Starlink satellites from the Falcon upper stage in relatively low orbit, so that if there are any mishaps, they all deorbit naturally fairly quickly. See the recent July launch failure, where all satellites burned up in the atmosphere in a matter of days. So low Earth orbit isn't just a sky full of stars, it's a sky full of debris, and SARS. Yes, that was my horrible attempt at a natural segue to discussing Rocket Lab's Sky Full of SARS mission, which launched yesterday from New Zealand's Mahia Peninsula. This was Rocket Lab's third of 4 dedicated launches for American space company Capella Space, and the payload for this mission was the single Acadia 3 Earth observation satellite. This is a synthetic aperture radar satellite, or SAR, hence the mission's name. The Acadia series of satellites are Capella's new generation of satellites, an upgrade from their older ones with better radar bandwidth for sharper images and faster delivery times. They also have advanced optical communication technology. In fact, Capella is the first commercial company to demonstrate optical inter-satellite links. The launch went off flawlessly, and the satellite is now reportedly in orbit and operational. Blue Origin is doing stuff with New Glenn. Exciting! Their Pathfinder booster prototype was recently seen at Port Canaveral, lying flat. Interestingly, here's a shot from Fariel of the booster lying down with the Falcon 9 visible for scale. Last week, Blue Origin conducted the first stand-up test of the prototype, using the port's breakover fixture as part of their systems testing for recovering boosters and transporting them from the port. After standing proud and vertical, the booster was then lowered horizontal once again. That's not the only New Glenn news to discuss though. Blue Origin CEO Dave Limp shared this video on Twitter showing off testing of New Glenn's reaction control system thrusters firing. Kerbal Space Program players will of course know what these are for, but these thrusters allow New Glenn to orient itself in 0G before it makes its landing on its ocean landing platform. We recently also saw official sharing of tests of the landing leg deployment for New Glenn, so I'm really hoping that this is a good step forward to Blue Origin being more open about the development progress of New Glenn. Lowne Aerospace was back in action last week. I decided that after 9 years of making Kerbal Space Program videos, it was finally time to put a base on Kerbin, as so eloquently highlighted by one of the comments on that video. I decided to build an Arctic base to help train Kerbals for future deep space surface missions, and also to test out building techniques with modded parts that would work well with the free IVA mod. If that sounds good to you, then check it out via that card on screen, but that does mark the end of today's video. I do hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, don't forget to like the video as well, and if you want to support the channel like the people on the left did there, then check out my Patreon or channel membership program. And of course, massive thank you to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Head on over to ground.news/MattLown to get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan for just $5 a month.